Measuring and communicating volunteer impact beyond hours and dollars. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover today. How demonstrating results goes beyond counting the number of volunteers and the hours of service they provide. We'll talk about new and emerging trends in quantitative and qualitative evaluation that position volunteer engagement as a valuable resource for mission fulfillment. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And we'll also take away some tools to make the case for volunteer engagement as a vital resource. So stay to the end for practical tips on measuring volunteer impact. We'll talk about defining recruitment and retention success, which I think has come up a little bit already, calculating return on volunteer investment, and tools and processes that can help you do that. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Elizabeth here to talk with us a little bit more about what all of this means.
Yeah, so I'm going to start us off by just kind of reading this and kind of grounding us in this space. So we're thinking about measuring and communicating the impact of volunteer involvement that can be designed to reveal how your volunteers are making that difference in your organization and how you're fulfilling your mission. So more than simply counting outputs like hours, how do we show meaningful impact that reveals how volunteers do all of these things we're seeing listed below, from enhancing the quality of your services to expanding your reach to bring in new skills, capacity, resources, community of ambassadors. There's so much beyond hours. And I really appreciated, Beth, as we were talking earlier, you kind of broke this down into 3 parts for us to kind of start guiding how we address this today. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. I do like to think about this in 3 spheres. You know, for so many decades, the focus has been in our sector around looking at just quantity. The hours that volunteers give, the number of volunteers, for example, and yet that doesn't really get to how being involved and contributing skills enhances organizational efficiencies. So that's one part of this. I guess I think of it as like three overlapping circles, right? These spheres of impact. One being the organization, and how does engaging volunteers free staff up to do other work that they are uniquely qualified to achieve? How does engaging volunteers extend the reach or enhance the brand of the organization? Second sphere is, of course, how engaging volunteers enhances the ability of the organization to impact its constituents or to serve its clients, right? So how does it enhance those who are receiving services from the organization? Are they increasing the quality of a program? Are they reducing loneliness or isolation among seniors who live alone? Are they enhancing literacy rates among students being tutored? And then the third is, of course, how does being involved enhance the volunteer's life and well-being as well? And we see increasingly that volunteerism enhances health and well-being, mental health, even physical health, and are associated with reduced, or not reduced mortality, but increased longevity, and other health benefits among individuals who volunteer. Not to mention, it makes them more informed citizens and is often associated with other civic engagement actions. So I always like to think about the question when we talk about what difference does it make to have volunteers involved. It's really 3 questions. How does it help the organization? How does it help people being served by the organization, and how does it benefit the volunteer as well?
That's great.
I think we've heard so often. Oh, sorry, Cora.
No, I really appreciate that multiple kind of faceted perspective. What were you going to say, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I was just thinking often the group here in the webinars have shared with us how community building and relationship is so important, that's why people are coming to be part of the organization. So I think it just speaks to what you just said, Beth. Like, there is more than just the analytics behind the numbers of what the service was that day. There's community building, relationships, and I think that's so powerful when you can start to figure out. I think that's where my head always chomps at. How do we tell that story? And I know we're going to get into that today. So that's exciting.
Amazing. So Beth, tell us a little bit about, the work you do and how you look at these kind of three areas when you're working with organizations to help them measure volunteer impact.
Well, thanks. As Court said, I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. We're a Denver-based firm that works across the United States and Canada, occasionally beyond, exclusively on volunteer engagement strategies. So I'm tuning in from my Denver office and was happy to see at least a couple other Coloradoans on the call. Hello, Boulder. Hello, Denver. I saw you on here. Thank you for joining on this sunny day here. Um, and we work with organizations in training and strategy, and in terms of how we work with organizations around these three spheres, it really is posing those questions and then helping them discern different strategies to help answer those questions. And when I think back to my decades of experience in this world, way back when I started my career in museums, I was working as an anthropologist and an educator in museums that were very that had volunteers engaged in all arenas, and I didn't realize at the time the path that I was carving for myself was really all about volunteer engagement. But one of my first big projects here in Denver, when I moved here a while ago with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, was actually as an educator, but looking at the question, how does interacting with a volunteer in a gallery affect a visitor's experience? And I engaged volunteers with me to do that research, co-published on it with a volunteer research partner. So it was really on this path of partnering with volunteers in a very real way. And even back then, we were looking at how does having a volunteer in the gallery change visitors' experience? That's the beneficiary side, right? I was engaging volunteers to do the research with me because we didn't budget for this for an outside consultant. So I had a team that was building our capacity to do the research. And my research partner of a volunteer benefited because this was her project as a returning student to help get her BA after being sort of a returning student 30 years later. So that sort of encapsulated where at the time we didn't have the same terminology, but kind of encapsulated what became a real passion for me. So hadn't thought about that till we were preparing for this webinar, but it was an interesting look back.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So let's talk. And I know we asked this a little bit when we were kind of hopping on and everyone was joining beforehand, but why is it actually hard to measure volunteer impact? Like, what are the challenges that exist in the sector of really kind of wrapping our minds around this and really truly measuring it? What is hard about this?
Well, in a word, I'll say part of the difficulty is simply inertia, right? Where it's hard to do something different and to change the way we've always been doing things. But I'll unpack that in a moment. What one of the difficulties is that we as leaders of volunteers, regardless of what our title is, it could be volunteer coordinator, it could be executive director, it could be anything else in between. We seem to be focused on responding to requests. And most often what we are requested to demonstrate is how many volunteers and how many hours. That may be because maybe a funder requests it. Maybe a funder hasn't even requested it, but our development department has requested it because they want to list it as an in-kind match in a funding proposal. Maybe it's all our CEO or board knows to ask about. And responding to requests makes revealing volunteer impact all about compliance, not relevance. And that's a challenge, right? The second piece is it is simply easier at times to count than it is to go deeper and reveal the impacts of volunteers. And if you'll indulge me for a moment or pardon me for a moment for reading, I want to quote my friend and colleague, Dr. Sue Carter-Kale, who is dedicated to this, to really looking at how we can better value and better articulate and communicate the value that volunteers bring. And I think that we'll have Shauna will, if she hasn't already, shared some links on here, but in one of Sue's blogs on her Volunteer Commons blog, she writes, in the book Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman talks about our tendency to swap a question that is hard to answer with one that is easier to answer. What's more, we usually aren't even aware that we have made the substitution. And I'll skip ahead. As difficult as it may be to get volunteers to submit their hours, and you may be going, oh yeah, that's sometimes hard, still seems easier than trying to capture the often intangible and hard to count contributions that volunteers make. And so when we stop trying to wrestle with the, sometimes we just substitute wrestling with these difficult questions with saying, well, we can at least count. That's easier. And then the third thing is that, again, I think it's just really easy to get caught in the inertia of just sticking with what we know. And it does take a little more time, though I purport not a ton more time, to really begin to look at these deeper stories and demonstrate the power and potential of volunteer involvement in these three spheres. How does it benefit the volunteer? How does it benefit our beneficiaries? How does it benefit our organization as a whole? And let's be honest, to simply say it was 972 hours, I don't know what that benefits. What does that even mean when it comes to those three spheres? So we'd have to get a little deeper, and hopefully you'll leave with some inspiration to do that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Go
And
ahead.
sorry, you and I are just going to talk over each other today. It's that day. Beth, I was curious when we talked a little bit about this, but that idea of change is sometimes frightening. So I think I was curious by your comment when we were talking about time. Like, how long does it take to get someone to be able to? I think someone said in the chat, they're constantly asked number of volunteers, number of hours. That's what they're used to having to report on. So that idea of we want to measure something different. Any suggestions there for the group of how you start changing, how do you start adding to it, and then how long does it take to start to do that? Is it a lengthy process, or is it just a different perspective?
I don't think it has to be. And in fact, I think, Elizabeth, you just said, how do you start changing or how do you start adding? I would purport we don't necessarily have to add. First, let's take a moment and assess what are we already doing? And the we is a broad we. Let's say we're engaging volunteers to help with resume writing or mock interviews if we do workforce development, and that's upon referral of the case manager. Or we have volunteers tutoring children, or so when we think of volunteers simply as a program in and of itself, we may not have access to all the same data, and we might have to create new data collection methods. But when we think about volunteers as our partners in fulfilling a strategy, then we can go to these case managers who are doing workforce development classes and case management among individuals seeking to go back into the workforce. And we look at what other ways are they already collecting information about those clients' experiences. They are likely already collecting data on trainings that they've taken, services they've benefited from, and how long it takes them to get to be, how many interviews they get, how many, when they get placed, how long they're in that placement. It would not be difficult to add a few questions in there about how did that resume review process, how did working with that volunteer enhance your confidence, for example. That's just integrating into something that already exists. And that would be the same with tutoring kids, or even when volunteers do conservation work, or I know we have someone from CERT on here. How does learning from a local community volunteer about emergency preparedness benefit the mental well-being and true preparedness of community members? And that's something we need to just connect to the volunteer experience as well.
That's interesting. Yeah. So it's almost like how do you combine sort of what might be considered anecdotal information or data that often is harder to count, but you could implement some kind of pre-survey, post-survey, maybe that's one idea.
Or integrate into what's already being collected and gathered around program metrics. Because my guess is for many of these programs, they are already collecting, whether it's pre and post, or participation data or evaluation data from participants on programs or visits or classes that they're taking. And then, you can integrate a few extra questions about volunteers into that. So yes, Elizabeth, it can take more time, but I challenge everyone first to say, what are we already doing and where can we insert this and apply that? Because that's far more efficient. And then it also helps make the case as we get into the benefits for why engaging volunteers can be so beneficial to our programs.
Interesting. Okay. So tell us a little bit more about, if we're kind of concerned about like maybe this is going to take extra time, maybe this is going to be able to, this is going to take a little more thought and effort to really kind of grapple with some of this other forms of data or other forms of measuring impact. What are the benefits that we could really see in our organizations, in our volunteerism efforts, in the work that we're doing in the community by taking the time and thoughtfulness to do this?
So I think it's really helpful in a lot of different ways. There are lots of different benefits of getting beyond simply hours and dollars. In terms of enhancing our accountability, certainly, we often as nonprofit organizations may be receiving funding from, from individual donors or funders to whom we have some accountability to report outcomes. But even just as public institutions, to the board and the public, we have accountability to demonstrate how these programs are benefiting the community, and volunteers are part of that. So understanding volunteers' role and connection in that, I think, will be or influence on those outcomes are part of our overall accountability as organizations. It also can really help to motivate not only current volunteers, prospective volunteers. The number one reason that individuals seek volunteer opportunities consistently is a chance to make a difference and to have an impact. And, if you ask a volunteer or think back yourself to a time when you had a really good, positive volunteer experience, you say, how do you know you made a difference? And I've asked this of thousands of people over my last few decades. Nobody says, oh, I know I made a difference because I served 37.5 hours. No one says that. It's because they helped that child read, or they helped get this puppy adopted, or they, whatever those reasons are. And so it's a way to motivate and recognize current volunteers, but also a way to promote volunteering with your organization by giving people a chance to envision, prospective volunteers, a chance to envision the difference that they could be making if they choose to share their time with you. It's also case making for budget. Despite the myth, I don't want to give away our next webinar on myths, but despite the myth that volunteers are free, volunteers are not free, and engaging them effectively takes an investment of time, of money, of space, of technology. And so to be able to demonstrate in some robust ways how that investment pays off is really important when we're making the case to maintain that investment or even increase that investment. And finally, it can help with evaluation of our volunteer strategies themselves. Another thing that Sue talks about is the promise we make to volunteers, the practices we have in place to support them, and the proof that those practices actually are helping us engage volunteers to achieve that promise that we've made to them and to our program participants, to the students we tutor or families we're helping to feed. And so really understanding the impact is part of our evaluation. Do we have the practices in place that are really going to get us to the outcomes that we're seeking?
Yeah, I saw in the chat, Carly brought in like the reflection times, which I think is really interesting, Beth, because what I hear there is if you come in as the volunteer coordinator with that mindset of what am I looking for? I'm looking for what motivated them to be here today. I'm looking for what was it they did that they do feel like they made a difference in. Then that reflection time could drive some of these impacts that you start reporting and measuring, because it's naturally already there and happening. And you can just start to hone your reflection time and your surveys and what you're counting to actually incorporate what you're learning in the reflection time, which I think is just a beautiful idea.
Yeah, if I can build on that, Carly and Elizabeth, I feel like that takes a page out of what I usually associate with service learning, where service learning is about, studying and preparation, having that experience, and then reflecting. And that just makes it a richer experience, especially if one of those spheres that you want to impact are the volunteers. It gives them a chance to integrate their learning and perhaps understand a little more of the root causes of the issue or how they could take additional actions to help, to help this cause that they care about. So.
Excellent. Well, let's keep going. Talk to us about these different methods of measuring and communicating impact. Give us a little overview here before we dig in.
Sure. So, so here I am saying, it's challenging, but I want to inspire everyone to diversify how you track and I'll say reveal the impact that volunteers have. Measure, even though that's what we title this, measure can also be a limiting term. And so I think that what we have time today to talk about are three different buckets, I'll say. First is still, yes, understanding that it is an industry standard in some industries to count hours and to monetize that, to put a financial value to it. So we do want to unpack that and share some emerging practices that might help a little bit tell that story in a richer way. Then I want to go to the other end of the spectrum and talk about the balanced scorecard approach, which really looks at it's an approach that really aligns with strategic planning and looks at mission aligned outcomes. And then we'll kind of settle in the middle with some that may be a little easier to move towards if you're not quite ready to take on the balanced scorecard approach. And that is simply just looking at outcomes and getting beyond outputs and looking at outcomes. So that's what we'll try to unpack in our remaining time today.
Amazing. Yeah, I definitely have been hearing a lot of conversation around all of these terms. And for me, really just kind of grappling through the differences of what they mean. So talk to us a little bit about the value of volunteer time.
Sure. So in case, and I realize not everyone tracks hours, and my message is not leave the session and start tracking hours. But I know I'm working with a group in Delaware right now. I was like, well, we don't track hours. Maybe we need to start. I was like, oh, wait, that may not be your most valuable outcome. However, let me share a little bit about it. So even if you don't do it, you can kind of know where to go for some information. So it has for many decades been standard for some organizations to count and track the hours and then report the hours that volunteers provide. There's pros and cons to that. A pro is it's standardized. Organizations that want to reward quantity and longevity of volunteers, then this can become a data point that's helpful to honor milestones like, oh, you gave 1,000 hours this year, you get an extra call out at our annual appreciation dinner or something like that. And in terms of valuing those hours, which is what many organizations do. Most organizations look to the independent sector, which is an organization that supports the nonprofit and sort of public sector organizations. And every year, based on national economics and local economics, the independent sector publishes a national value and a state by state value per hour of what a volunteer's hour of work is valued at. So, $31 and 12 cents or something like that. And you can look at independent sector and find your state's value as well. And then, at these annual events, we'd say, oh, it was 862 hours that our volunteers contributed, or 12,000 hours. And that is a value of X thousands of dollars or X hundreds of thousands of dollars, or for some organizations, millions of dollars. And, again, it is a standardized way of looking at that value. The drawback, the con, is that it's not that you have that budget anyway. It's not like the organization had that financial stores stuffed away somewhere, which if they didn't have volunteers, they would be able to access and hire people to do the same work. So that's a little bit of a challenge. One organization that I worked with in New Hampshire, I really liked their approach. They at least They looked at these hours, they looked at the financial value, but they translated it into mission related dollars. So this is families in transition. They go by FIT in New Hampshire. They help individuals who are experiencing homelessness move to a more stable home situation. The volunteers don't work in their residential facilities. The volunteers work in their resale shops. And due to a volunteer leadership initiative, they were able to increase their volunteer hours and almost more than double their volunteer hours within just the course of 1 year. And they were able to report back saying these extra hours represent a value equal to housing 38 families for an entire year. And by putting it in the terms of mission, it at least told a better story. That said, it's not, they didn't have that cash. They weren't actually able to house 38 poor families, just put it in terms that were mission aligned. Other challenges are that not all volunteers do work that has the same value. Some are doing, lower level, low skilled roles, while others may be providing, pro bono legal services. So wage replacement is another approach that just takes this a little further. Looking at sources like Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can get a more accurate assessment. I don't know, most organizations do this for a whole program, but some do it for one or two roles, like an initiative, planning an event, or one summer program. And they can look up, what does it cost to have, what really are the wages that a landscaper would be paid if they were doing some outdoor work in a gardens, and what would a marketing expert be paid. So it's a little more accurate in that way. The flip side, the con, is that I've seen so many employees eyes glaze over or start worrying when I talk about financial value of volunteer time, because they're quickly calculating, going, that volunteer is being valued at higher than my salary. So staff can often be threatened by this when we talk about it in these terms. And so I always encourage leadership to say, this is how volunteers extend our resources, not save us dollars, but extend our resources. Finally, there is the recognition that these values, wage replacement, value of volunteer time, only look at one half the equation. That they only tell the story of what's being contributed in terms of time, but not what's being invested in it. So about 10 to 13 years ago, Points of Light and Reimagining Service and California volunteers all partnered as part of the development of the Service Enterprise Initiative to look at a calculation that recognizes both sides of the equation. And we call that return on volunteer investment. So I'm not going to give you a math test this morning, I promise. And we have some resources that can actually spell this out for you. But the bottom line is, this is a formula that looks at the value of volunteer contribution. We still track hours, we still ascribe an hourly value to them, but we look at what's that net contribution by subtracting what we invested and divide that by the total investment. And basically what we're able to say at the end of that calculation is, every dollar our organization invests in volunteer engagement through your salary or part of your salary, through recognition, through getting top of the line technology to help manage and engage volunteers, all of these investments, every dollar we invest, we get a return of $3.72 or $8.12 in volunteer value. And that has changed the conversation among many development directors and funders, among volunteer leaders and the board or director about what budgets should be invested. And that's a way to really, I think it's been a game changer. And it's just one tool, but it's a helpful tool, especially when we're trying to make the case.
And Beth, it looks like we've got one question which might apply to this slide. I'll just pause, and if you have, if you think that there's something else more applicable. But Abby says, I'm curious how that kind of mission aligned term is quantified. How do you quantify the value of a volunteer's work helping a teacher, for example? So I'm curious, what your recommendation would be on that. And if
that is a perfect
page.
question, Abby and Court, as a lead into the next measure, which maybe I'm going to say stay tuned, and I will answer that, Abby, because I think it has to do with being able to quantify. Yeah, we're talking about our mission. That said, I am going to just take one more second. You don't have to scroll back, but I do want to say kind of pros and cons of the Rho V value as well. Pros are that it shows both sides of the equation. The con, and I want to say this in case you want to start utilizing a value like return on volunteer investment, Rho V, is that often when we're really investing in a volunteer strategy, the Rho V goes down before it goes up. So it is a point in time, but as we begin to perhaps expand our commitment to staffing a volunteer engagement or increasing our operations by having, better technology like Get Connected, often that it takes a little while for that investment to pay off. So that's a value that we need to be in for the long game. So I just wanted to say that.
I like
Okay,
how you shared before too, that you talked about extending a staff person. So I think that was really interesting too, because when I think about the time it takes to extend a staff person, if you're pulling in volunteers to take some of that work, then that moment of I've got to train that volunteer, that's going to take time. But once that volunteer is fully functioning, then I think you phrased it as the thing that only you can do. You
Frees you
have
up to do
time
the
for
work,
that.
right, for which
So
you're
now
uniquely qualified. Yep.
that value is back. And so it's kind of like, again, some of these things taken, I think that's that thing that you have to communicate to leadership. They have this ramping up, they have this investment before return, whether it's your time being extended to something you never got to before because you finally have automation here or a volunteer taking something off your plate, or as you just said in your other example, it goes down before it goes up. But I think if that's the expectation, then it's not bad when it happens. It's just, this is what's expected. Yep. Now we're going to see the return. We've hit that point. Now we measure again and we start climbing. So yeah, I love it. I'm glad you drew that out for us all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So do you want me to go ahead, Court?
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like definitely something to anticipate, plan for, measure at different points. And then you can kind of see how some of those investments in volunteer engagement are really paying it forward to your mission. So talk to us a little bit about the balance scorecard so we can get to Abby's question. I think I have another question too about that'll be fun after this one.
Great. So again, we're moving from like what's easy to do, what's easy to, what's simply measurable to looking at what's really meaningful, right? We don't want to just track what's measurable. We want to track what's meaningful. And so the balanced scorecard approach, the volunteer balanced scorecard approach is, it's been around now for, I guess maybe it's close to 10 years. I think the book was published in 2014, maybe. And it really is an approach that unpacks that question of not just how do we measure what's meaningful, but what is meaningful. And that's one of the reasons why I love it. So this balanced scorecard approach was developed by a group of your peers, hospital volunteer services directors from the Toronto metropolitan area, who were meeting as peers. And among the challenges that they were trying to unpack was, how do we really communicate and appropriately value the different ways that volunteers contribute to our hospitals, recognizing that there may be, and usually were at each hospital, dozens or or in most cases, hundreds of volunteers working in, say, info desk or, patient support. I think we used to call them candy stripers, patient support types of things. And so they would get a lot of, out of sheer numbers and hours, they would get a lot of the attention and value. And yet, some of the hospitals had these really small but incredibly impactful groups of volunteers. The one that really sticks in my mind are a group of, I think it was only like 2 to 4 volunteers who happened to be deaf or hearing impaired and were excellent lip readers. And they were engaged as volunteers in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, to help when patients could no longer vocalize, but could mouth the words that they wanted to share and communicate with their families. And these volunteers served as interpreters. And whether those people recovered or sadly, if they didn't, that role of those 2, 3, 4 volunteers was so impactful, and yet it was getting lost in just measuring hours. So this group came together for weeks and probably years, and started looking for other measures from other businesses and other areas of business operations that could be applied and tested and adapted for volunteer engagement. And they found one called the Balanced Scorecard Approach. It was originally developed by Kaplan and Norton, and they adapted it for volunteer engagement. And I think one of the reasons I love it, because I'm such a nerd, is that it's all about good strategic planning, and no one loves strategic planning more than I do. And so it really gets down to, and they published it in a book called Measuring the Impact of Volunteers: A Balanced and Strategic Approach. And so and I think yes, thank you. Shauna already posted it. It's not my scorecard, but it's what I'm referencing. Posted a link to the book in the chat. So it's all about looking at your organization's mission and core priorities. Maybe your organization has a priority, like this example here, of enhancing client staff experiences, committing to quality improvement, developing internal and external partnerships, and maybe even a fourth one is, enhancing financial stability or building capacity to reach more audiences, whatever it is. And then the process is about looking at how do volunteers drive success as our partners in achieving some of these strategic priorities? What are the metrics we can be tracking? What are the indicators of that? And then how do we map out and tell that story to leadership as it relates to, how volunteers drive success against all of these priorities? And there are templates and tools that you can use from the book. It's not something you can just sort of sit in your office and do alone. You need others from the organization to help with it, but it can tell a really powerful story. And I've done this process with American Tree Farm System, which is a national organization in the States around that helps tree farmers. I've done it with I'm currently working on it with another environmental group, particularly their advisory group. And it's been really helpful with advisory groups to say, where really is our activity, and how do we want to align with priorities, and how can we use these templates to help us tell that story? So what I love about is it elevates volunteer engagement from being a program that's nice to have, where volunteers are the program participants, those being served, to instead saying, how are we partnering with volunteers as our to help us achieve our strategic priorities? So it's a great endeavor. That is a bigger commitment to one of your first questions. How much time does it take? But it's worth it if you're able to do that.
Beth, thanks for presenting this. This was something that I hadn't experienced before, but, measuring the impact of volunteers, a balanced and strategic approach looks like a great book for all of us to read. And for me too, it really was meaningful because, I have been involved in some, nonprofits where our focus, like our vision and our mission, was on depth. So we didn't have big numbers. We had a small number of students we were working with, 10 students max, 2 volunteers. And, the program was really niche. But, our focus was depth throughout the course of the school year of building those relationships. And so I feel like using some of these other, more balanced approaches helps us see the impact when it comes to the vision and the mission of the organization. I feel like it starts at the roots. And so that's what's really exciting to me about looking at this. And I've got a question in here that I want to bring up because it might lead into the next one, but I want to hear what you have to say. So someone was saying, does anyone have a methodology on how to quantify the benefits of food distributions or pantries to families, or enhancing SNAP benefits? So that's an interesting question. Is how do we know, what's the best way to quantify the benefits of food distribution? I think that there's a lot of nonprofits doing that work.
Well, first, I want to make sure that we give a chance that the chat that's going on between participants is so inspiring. So I think if we have other food insecurity, professionals in this, please answer, because I see great conversations about quantities of weeds and all sorts of other things going on. And I would say that, again, I would look at, what are your there's some, I think, really high level, perhaps more challenging things to collect, but your organization might already be collecting it, like, um, uh, you know, what are the benefits to the family from having that additional food security? Are they able to pay their heat? Are they able to get kids to school because they're sick less often because they have better nutrition, right? There are other measures of wellness that if depending on how sort of wrap around your services as a human service agency might be, that you could track to. But there are even other things, like we were working with some pantries in New York City right before and then at the outbreak of the pandemic. And of course, those were organizations that had a multifold increase in demand for services. And one of the things we were able to do in talking about how engaging volunteers drove success is that by engaging volunteers to help with distributions, they were able to remain open. They were able to extend the hours that the pantry was open, which then allowed them to reach more families and new families. And so even though that isn't necessarily the direct benefit like the bigger ones I was just talking about, it still was an important change. It wasn't more volunteers, it was different volunteers. It wasn't just quantity, it was getting the right volunteers who could help extend their hours and make their services available to newer audiences who needed it. And reduce wait time, which also helped. So, couple different thoughts.
Oh, I really appreciate hearing that, because I do know that, a huge barrier to access often is the hours that the services are available. And so to be able to hear that we could measure the fact that we got these volunteers involved, we were able to keep this open longer and reach more people, that makes so much sense to me, because that's something that I hear a lot regarding working hours or being able to travel to locations. So that's really meaningful. Thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about, I think that, one of the words that you said earlier, this idea of output versus outcome. Did I get that correct?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So outputs are just, what did the organization do? But outcomes answer the question, so that, or so what, right? So they distributed 900 meals a week, so that, what were the outcomes? So that, um, you know, families had better nutrition, so that students could be more ready in their learning, so that they could heat their homes. So, so it's really about the outcomes, the changes in behavior or changes in in state as a result of these programs. So it could be still almost around that output end of things. How do volunteers help increase the number of individuals reached? We worked with a hospital in California who finally realized, we could have volunteers help deliver our health education programs, and as a result, they were able to reach hundreds more individuals in the community to help them better understand how to manage their chronic health challenges, right? So they could reach more people. Number of individuals served directly by volunteers, or maybe it's services delivered. Lots of chatter in the chat going on around, trees planted, pounds of food collected, pounds of food delivered, weed volume that's been mitigated. But then there's also those changes in behavior or condition for those served, like increase in reading level among those tutored, improved health among those who receive volunteer training, and increased capacity or resources. So one of my favorite examples actually has to do with mulch. So we work with the city of Fort Collins, and they do an annual mulch shoveling day, like a spring cleanup, where it's a great family engagement opportunity where families come out to our often drought-ridden state, and help shovel metric ton upon metric ton of mulch onto city plantings in the medians, or in some of their parks. And that's not just for beautification. In our state, that really helps tamp down the moisture and retain moisture, which can then reduce the watering burden on the city. So, as a thank you to the volunteers, the facilities department can certainly send out an email and say, thank you, families, for participating. You and, 832 other individuals from our town came out and shoveled X number of metric tons of mulch. Thanks so much. That's outputs. But when we go into outcomes, we get to, they take it a step further and they say, as a result of your work, we anticipate saving, as we did last year and the year before, X million gallons of water and X number of dollars for that water for our city. And that in a, conservation minded and again, drought conscious area is really powerful, that they understand that they didn't just come out and have a good time and make their streets prettier, but they're actually helping their city, helping save money, helping other taxpayers, and helping the environment as well. So that's where I like to see it different, and or kind of move beyond. And if you're intrigued by this and still need some help in thinking, how do I think differently about this? There's a great tool that hopefully Shauna can find in our resources called the Value of Volunteering Wheel, and she'll put a link to it in the chat. It's a great tool that came out in 2016 by Volunteer Canada, their national association that promotes volunteerism and participation and philanthropy. And it's a really interesting tool. I've had some clients say it's just too overwhelming, but for others, it's really kind of it just really resonates. It's a wheel that has it kind of takes my idea of 3 spheres and blows it up even more. They look at these different stakeholder groups, like kind of wedges, and they look at how does volunteering affect the volunteer, the organization, businesses, neighborhoods, and society as a whole. And there are different measures in each because it's based on the idea, the premise that volunteering can help promote connection, capacity, competence, and so it kind of takes each of those and says, how might volunteering help our local businesses? Does it provide workforce development? That might be something we want to be tracking and telling the story about. I worked with an organization in another one in New Hampshire that works with refugees, and in summer 2020, in anticipation of the census, the 2020 census, they were engaging volunteers to reach out to refugees to help educate them on what the census is all about, because a lot of these refugees would have been very worried if individuals called them from the government wanting to know about how many people lived in their households and things like that. But by educating them about the census, they were actually helping society. And this volunteer wheel, Value of Volunteering Wheel, provided some language around how to talk about how it helps, enhance funding in their neighborhood, have a more informed votership, et cetera. So a couple thoughts about how to get beyond whatever you're already tracking.
Amazing. I know that my wheels are turning. And I know that one of the things that Elizabeth and Shauna work with everyone in our Get Connected on network on is really making sure that they've got a place, and Elizabeth often calls it a catcher's mitt, to make sure that they're really able to engage volunteers through the system and really collect that data in meaningful ways. And I know, Elizabeth, there's a few different ways that people, because we had one question about, how do we get like a remote volunteer or a not on-site volunteer to let us know what they're doing and really kind of collecting that data. Is there anything that you want to share a little bit about regarding that?
I think we have to kind of go back to where Beth's been sharing of how do you approach it and what are you looking for? Because I think some of the things that are so powerful in systems is just the ability to add one more question that's important that helps round out the information you're collecting. So systems like ours, having something that when they log their hours, they're asked an additional question that maybe is more toward that the impact or the outcome, not just the output. And especially, as we always say, and make sure they know why you're asking. They need to understand you're doing something with this. There's a part where if you've got a bold goal of water conservation, you've made that clear. And so every time you're trying to track how many hours were spent weeding, how many weeds were pulled, and something else, then making sure that everyone in the organization knows, like, that is our big, bold goal. And if we don't get this from you, we can't watch that measurement change. So I think that part of understanding why you're asking And then thinking about how in your current workflow, do you start to round out or just change the questions so that you're getting to a deeper level of answer. People answer questions that are in front of them that are simple, especially when they're completing what they were supposed to do to complete out the experience. I'm making it sound easier than it is. Anyone who's a volunteer manager knows you are herding cats and trying to beg and plead for them to collect hours, and they forget quite often. So I love that ours is a little flexible and you can go back and fix it if you didn't capture it in the moment. But that piece is so important to just make sure they know why you're asking, and then have those repetitions that say, hey, you haven't done it yet. Can you add it now? This is so important to us because your work is so important to us and we need to be able to include it in our measurements.
Yeah, and really, I like to add to that also just the importance of communicating the impact that volunteers have made back to them, because that is, another huge piece that we've seen from engagement strategy. And so being able to have a place where you can easily put that information and share that right back with them through a really great email or something that follows up after a specific volunteer opportunity. If you've collected some measurements, meaningful measurements, I'm going to start calling them actually. From that very specific opportunity, you can send that to your volunteers if you're using a system like ours, like Get Connected, where you can know exactly who was present at each opportunity. So we are like rounding out here. We've got 5 minutes, and I have to say this chat has been really phenomenal. Beth, with these bonus take actions here, why don't you just give us a little sneak peek of what everyone can expect from the amazing worksheets that you've provided that they will all receive on Monday in a download?
Sure. So my 3 suggested next steps are: first, pause and think about what you already do in terms of evaluating programs, volunteer experiences, client experiences, because again, this isn't about doing something completely new. It's about integrating into what already exists. Take a moment to think about how you define success. And you, one of the worksheets that you'll be getting is, or one section of it is about how are you going to define recruitment success and retention success that will help you then collect anecdotes and data. And the plural of anecdote is not data, but anecdotes is really helpful, or can be helpful to color in the lines of data. And then, select what's meaningful. And there are also tools like the ROVI calculation, return on volunteer investment. And I think, my third step, once you define success, is to pilot 1 or 2 new ways that will reveal the impact of volunteer involvement, whether it's ROVI or looking at different retention metrics or integrating into program evaluation methods that are already in place. Pilot 1 or 2 of them. Don't just measure what you can, measure what's meaningful, and see what that, how telling that is for you. And if you need to change, you can change, but start with 1 or 2. That's my suggestion.
Excellent. All right. We're kind of coming up here in our last 3 minutes, but I want to, first of all, before we log off, just say a huge thank you to Beth Steinhorn, president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, for being with us. And to let you know that you can come join us again in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about Myth Busting 101, which is toppling the 5 myths of volunteer engagement with Beth. Shauna is dropping the link to sign up for that webinar. That will be on the 14th of December. So before everyone's holiday break. We've also got information for you to connect with Beth and learn more about her organization's work. And if you have questions about what we do here at Get Connected, providing volunteer management software to actually over 50,000 organizations across North America, with over 2 million volunteers. All of our information is there in the chat for you to easily connect with us and learn more about the work we do. And also you can check out our learning center, galaxydigital.com/blog, that has tons of volunteer management and leadership resources for you. I will make sure to get the recording out to everyone. And if there are questions that I didn't get to today, I just want you to know they're incredibly important. I'm going to try and send resources out that will respond to those. So blogs, downloads, anything that will help you with those things. And yes, there will be a recording in your inbox on Monday. So any last thoughts? We've got 60 seconds left. Volunteer leaders are the most busy and amazing people. So we're just really grateful y'all spent time with us today.
Yeah.
Beth, did you have any kind of closing thoughts you wanted to share?
I'll just thank you all for the work that you do. It is challenging, and we've been thrown a lot of curveballs in the last couple of years. Many of you are new to the field, so know that that you are not alone, and there are great resources, and that the more we can tell the story of the impact that volunteers have, the more we can tell the story of the amazing resource that you all can tap on behalf of the organization. So thank you.
I think last plug, Court, you mentioned the blog, but I think the blog also has 3-part series. So part 1 was before, this was part 2. We're going into part 3, but if you missed part 1, I think you'll be able to find that on that blog as well. So if you just want to go back and kind of spend some more time, I know we talked about, some of us have downloaded it and listened to it like a podcast and just kind of had that refresher while brushing our teeth. You know, sometimes there's something that just sticks with you and it's a nugget you can take with you. So hopefully it'll be something that is really powerful. And I love when, Court, you say, if you get one good nugget, then that is going to be something that hopefully makes a difference for you next week. So I hope you all got that. And thank you again for joining us. Do appreciate you all.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you very soon, Beth, in 2 weeks for that next webinar to kind of close out 2023. And thank you to all the volunteer leaders present today. We hope to see you there. And we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.